Prehistory of Egypt. The prehistory originated in Europe, and therefore it was natural that all its terminology and scientific expressions were purely European. The study of this science began in Western Europe, and therefore, we find some differences. When we try to apply the results achieved in this area to the results achieved in Eastern Europe, it is not surprising, then, that if there are differences in the results known in Europe, we find similar differences when applied to other countries on Earth. This is natural, as the soil and conditions of each country give it a unique character that distinguishes it from others in many ways. Before delving into our topic, we must ask, to what extent does prehistory in Egypt agree with prehistory in Europe? And to what extent does it differ? The answer to this is that, to the best of our knowledge, they often agree, unless something emerges that contradicts this in the future. Therefore, in studying Egyptian prehistory, we must trace the prehistory of Europe to that of Egypt, linking them together, and then bringing each closer to the other. This way, it will be easier for us to study this era of our country's history. The prehistory of Egypt is limited to the period from when humans first appeared in the Nile Valley to the beginning of the First Dynasty, around 3200 BC. Research conducted by scientists over the past 40 years has divided this long era into three main sections. The first of these remains unrecognized by all scholars, as some acknowledge it and others deny it. The first era, the Aeolian, is called the Pre-Paleolithic era. It includes the chert stones found in nature, with some refinement. The second era, also called the Old Stone Age, is the Paleolithic era. The stone was simply polished after cutting, and from it branched out the Stone Age. It was the era of polished stone after polishing. The third era, the Neolithic era, marked the beginning of the use of metals. In this era, stone, copper, and iron were used to make tools. Metals were used side by side. Before discussing these eras in some detail, we must note that it is almost impossible to pinpoint a specific date for prehistoric times in Egypt, except when we enter the era of the beginning of the use of metals that we compare the tools that appeared in the era and establish relative dates, especially after studying pottery, which appeared in the Neolithic era. The first to conduct this unique study was Professor Flinders Petrie. He did so by means of observations he derived from studying intact graves found in cemeteries dating back to the era of the beginning of the use of metals. He was able to arrange the various types of pottery found in these graves into categories that appeared at successive times and numbered them from 1 to 80. These numbers correspond to what is called the succession of dates or the history of succession. The number 80 corresponds to the beginning of the true historical era, i.e., the era in which writing appeared. In his historical sequence, he took the number 30, Flinders Petrie, and the first work undertaken by Sir 30 to Watt, and assigned it to the oldest types of pottery known to his time, and reserved the number from 1 inch the hope that he might uncover pottery even older than what was known. In fact, a very ancient site was recently discovered in the town of Badari, dating back to before number 30, and scholars assigned it 29. Although it is almost impossible to conclusively date an era, indeed, number 20 before Egyptian history, we can, provisionally, state approximately that the Neolithic era probably began 10,000 years ago, and that the beginning of metallurgy began approximately 6,000 or 5,000 years ago. These dates are not based on scientific facts, but are intended merely as a guide or indication. Now we will return to discussing each prehistoric era in its natural order in a brief statement, then discuss each era in some detail. The Aeolian Period. There is no doubt that when the first humans appeared on the surface of the earth, their first concern was to find a weapon to defend themselves against the animals that surrounded them and among whom they lived. The first weapons they thought of must have been those within their reach. For example, they would cut a tree branch and trim it to defend themselves. They would also gather the hard stones that nature had provided for them, then trim them slightly to give them a sharp edge and use them for their own purposes. The tools that were made in this way are called iolites in geology. Geologists attribute these tools to the Tertiary Geological Period, but the existence of this era in human life on Earth is doubtful, due to the complete absence of human remains from this era. In Egypt, people have been able to collect several pieces of this era. machinery from the Sahara Plateau, but their dating is also questionable. This is because the effects of weather factors, such as heat and cold, and the alternation of day and night, cause new pieces of the tumbler to disintegrate, resembling many pieces of this type from the ancient Aeolian Schweinfurt stations. Professor Al-Maluk has collected the gates of the kings. Although many of these artifacts show the work of human hands, we find them mixed with tools from the subsequent era, the so-called Paleolithic, Old Stone Age. We have no reason to believe that. They date back to an earlier era. In fact, there is no ancient or modern Egyptian station that does not contain tools made by human hands and pieces made by nature itself, which were then skillfully used by humans. There is no dispute that the principle of economy in the use of human power and production played a significant role in early human life in Egypt, as was the case in other countries. It is therefore not surprising that humans used natural tools to help them accomplish their purposes in their early development, during the period when they were unfamiliar with industries. The Paleolithic. This period is known as the era of the use of polished stone. It is divided into three sections. The Lower Paleolithic, which includes the European equivalents of the Chilean and Acheulean industries. The Middle Paleolithic, which is dominated by the Mysterian industries. The Upper Paleolithic, which is dominated by the Aurignacian industry. The Magdalenian, which is dominated by the Solutrean industry. And the Magdalenian, which is dominated by the Solutrean industry. The Neolithic Age. The Neolithic Age follows the preceding era, the era of the beginning of metallurgy, which is the era of the use of polished stone after refinement. This era has confusing divisions, and there is no need to delve into them now. The era of the beginning of the use of metals. This is the transitional era, during which humans began to use metals, and the use of copper, gold, bronze, and iron was successively introduced. However, the era of iron use in Egypt was unusual compared to other countries, as this metal began to be used in Egypt during the height of its historical glory and prestige, despite having been previously unknown. The Paleolithic city. This era is the period in which the first traces of human remains were found. Indeed, some human bones and tools used by humans were found there. However, it is impossible to determine in which period and how many thousands of years BC humans appeared on the planet. All that can be confirmed on this subject is that the presence of humans on Earth dates back to very ancient times. Moderate estimates date the appearance of humans back several thousand years. During this very long era, great and obvious changes and fluctuations occurred, not only in the form and manufacture of tools and the human form that used them, but also in the climatic fluctuations that surrounded it, the effect of which was a complete change in the animals and plants that lived and grew there. This era in question falls at the beginning of the Quaternary Geological Period, and during this period, the atmosphere fluctuated from cold to hot, as geologists have proven. This period was characterized by the advance of ice that covered the towering mountains and then retreated again, causing temperatures to drop. What is important to us here is that the Lower Paleolithic began at the end of an era in which glacial retreat occurred, while the Middle and Upper Paleolithic periods coincided with successive glacial periods. With the advent of the Neolithic, a new period of glacial retreat began, which continues to this day.